Let us start with the most honest sentence anyone has said about this Indiana Fever situation all season. Stephanie White does not trust Caitlin Clark to end games. Not as a hot take, not as fan frustration dressed up as analysis, as a calm, documented, evidenced observation from someone who watched the game footage and arrived at the only conclusion the footage supports. Clark was the third option on the game-winning possession. Mitchell first, Boston second, Clark third. On a possession where the player who had converted 11 consecutive free throws was standing on the floor available and ready and had spent the entire game demonstrating exactly the kind of clutch execution that end-of-game situations require. Third option, that designation tells you everything about the coaching philosophy operating inside this organization that no press conference statement or rotation justification or diplomatic characterization of the Clark and White relationship has been willing to say directly. The head coach of the Indiana Fever does not trust her franchise player to make the most important decision of the most important possession of the game. She trusts two other players more. She designs the play around those two players. And the game winner only happened because Sophie Cunningham looked at that design and made a different choice. The "it is what it is" qualifier that closes this clip is not resignation. It is the specific rhetorical move of someone who has watched enough basketball to know that arguing about this is unnecessary because the evidence has already made the argument more completely than any commentary could. White does not trust Clark to end games. The play design confirmed it. The third option designation confirmed it. The Sophie Cunningham rogue pass confirmed it. It is what it is, and what it is happens to be the entire problem.
I'm gonna be honest here. Stephanie White does not trust Caitlin Clark to end games. She does not trust Caitlin Clark to be on the floor to end games. Again, we saw it. And by the way, to say that people are saying, oh, she's not an option at all. No, she was an option for the game winner. She was the third option. They would have rather got the ball in Kelsey's hands and they would have rather got the ball in Leah Boston's hands. And that's fine. That's fine. It is what it is.
Numbers do not have agendas. Numbers do not have emotional investments in coaching decisions or organizational narratives or the outcome of accountability conversations. Numbers simply record what happened and present it without qualification. To anyone willing to look at them honestly, look at these numbers honestly. 4 defensive possessions. Clark subbed off for defensive reasons on every single one. 7 points surrendered. And embedded within those 7 points, the most damning detail this clip contains. One of those 4 possessions, the Chicago Sky threw the ball out of bounds without even attempting a play. Indiana gave up 7 points on 3 actual defensive stops while the player who was pulled for defensive reasons watched from the bench. That is not a defensive lineup that is working. That is not a rotation decision that can be defended through any tactical framework that connects the decision to the outcome in a logical sequence. That is a coaching staff removing the player they identified as a defensive liability and watching the defense perform worse after the removal than it was performing with her on the floor. The statistical record on this pattern is not a one-game sample. It has been documented across this entire season with enough consistency that it stops being a trend and becomes a verified finding. Indiana is legitimately horrendous in possessions where Clark is subbed off for defensive purposes. The team consistently gives up more points per possession with the defensive lineup that replaced her than they gave up with her on the floor. The decision that is supposed to strengthen the defense is actively weakening it every time it gets made, and then the Hines-Allen detail arrives, and the clip becomes something more devastating than a statistical breakdown. Both statistically best defenders on the roster pulled simultaneously. Clark and Hines-Allen, the 2 players the data identifies as Indiana's most effective defensive contributors, removed from the floor at the same time for defensive reasons while the team conceded 7 points on 3 possessions against an opponent, with 4 wins and 9 losses. The coaching staff pulled their 2 best defenders to improve the defense. 7 points in 4 possessions is what that decision produced. The numbers recorded it. They do not care about the explanation. They just kept counting.
Stephanie White wants to say, no matter what the public wants to say, you conceded 7. You subbed Caitlin Clark off for 3 defensive possessions yesterday. Sorry, 4. One of them, the Chicago Sky just threw the ball out of bounds. Like, they didn't even attempt to do anything. But you conceded 7 points. You conceded 7 points in 4 possessions, which is terrible. And this is not an uncommon thing. It's not uncommon that you foul every single time. Not only that,
this is the most important analytical framework this entire season has produced for understanding what is actually happening between Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White, and why the outcomes this organizational pairing keeps generating are not surprising when you understand the fundamental philosophical incompatibility at the center of it. Risk taker, risk-averse coach. Those 4 words contain the complete explanation for every rotation decision and every play design and every end-of-game situation and every press conference characterization and every documented tension this season has placed. On camera, Clark is built to take risks. Her entire competitive identity is constructed around the willingness to attempt things that the probability calculus does not always support, because her confidence in her own execution at the moment of decision is higher than the statistical expectation of success that a conservative analysis would assign to the attempt. The Baghdad game winner, the pull-up from 32 feet, the no-look passes that arrive at destinations the defense has not identified yet. These are not reckless decisions. They are high-risk, high-reward executions from a player whose internal confidence calibration is different from what conventional basketball coaching is designed to manage. White sees those decisions and does not celebrate them. She manages them. She designs systems that reduce the frequency of those decisions. She substitutes players who will make lower risk choices in situations where Clark would make higher risk ones. She builds a coaching philosophy around controlling the chaos that Clark's risk tolerance creates rather than weaponizing it against opponents who cannot prepare for it. That philosophical opposition is not correctable through conversation or film sessions or organizational meetings. It is structural. A risk-averse coach does not learn to trust a risk taker. A risk taker does not earn a risk-averse coach's trust by continuing to take the risks that define her competitive identity. The trust gap does not close. It gets managed and papered over with diplomatic press conference language, and then it reappears in every end of game situation where the play gets designed for the safer option. The "this is not sabotage" declaration at the end of this clip is the most important sentence, because it removes the conspiracy framing and replaces it with something more damaging. Sabotage implies intention. This is worse than intention. This is a fundamental philosophical mismatch between a generational talent and the coaching framework responsible for deploying that talent. It is not going to be fixed. It is not going to be resolved through effort or communication or additional time. It is a structural incompatibility producing predictable results every time it encounters a high-stakes situation. That is not sabotage. It is something the organization still has not acknowledged is the actual problem.
and that's not, it's a Steph White. Caitlin's a risk taker. You cannot, like, you have a risk-taking player with a risk-averse coach. It is what it is. It is what it is. Like, a risk-averse coach is never going to fully trust a risk taker. Like, that, it is what it is in basketball. And neither part, like, the defensive thing, Steph White is just enough evidence will tell you she's wrong. But in general, we're watching this time after time after time where it's so fucking clear that it's not going to work.
The NBA comparison does not arrive as a rhetorical flourish or a dramatic closing argument designed to generate emotional response. It arrives as the most precise and most damaging analytical observation this entire season has produced about the organizational accountability standard being applied to Indiana's situation versus what would be applied in any other professional basketball environment operating under normal competitive accountability expectations. Eric Spolstra, one of the greatest coaches in NBA history, multiple championships, a track record of organizational excellence that places him in the conversation about the best coaches the sport has ever produced. If Spolstra had looked at LeBron James and decided that the correct deployment of a 6'9" physical specimen built like a professional athlete at the absolute peak of his competitive powers was as a post-up center operating through a system designed for a different kind of player entirely, Spolstra would not have received a second season to implement that vision. He would have been fired, and the firing would have been considered obvious and correct and overdue by every person in the NBA ecosystem with enough basketball knowledge to evaluate the decision being described. Now apply that standard to Indiana. White has spent an entire season designing systems around players other than her franchise player. She has removed Clark from end-of-game defensive situations and watched the defense surrender more points without her than it surrendered with her.
And I'm gonna be honest, in any other sport, in any other league, like, if fucking if I don't know, if Spolstra was like, I want LeBron to be a post-up big. He's 6'9". He's built like Karl Malone. I want him to be a pick and roll player like Karl Malone. Spolstra would have been fired. And Spolstra one of the greatest ever. Like in any other scenario, if a coach was actively fighting against what their star player does.
She has made Clark the third option on game-winning possessions. She has run the offense through Raven Johnson while Clark stood on the floor available. She has benched Clark for 7 minutes of second quarters and entire fourth quarter stretches. She has presided over a 19-point lead, evaporating against a 4-9 team in the NBA that coaching staff does not survive this season. In any league operating under standard professional accountability expectations, the conversation about whether the coach and the player can coexist produces a resolution rather than continuing to generate content for the accountability conversation. Indefinitely, 3 all-WNBA caliber players on the same roster. A team that is struggling to beat tanking opponents. That combination does not happen by accident. It happens when the organizational framework around generational talent is working against the talent rather than with it. Spolstra would have been fired. White is still employed. The distance between those two outcomes is the Indiana Fever organizational accountability story in its most complete and most damning form. Outrow the risk-taker versus risk-averse coach framework this video introduced is not going away. It is the most analytically complete explanation for everything this season has documented that the accountability conversation has produced, and it deserves to be placed at the center of every subsequent discussion about what the Indiana Fever need to do to become the team their roster is capable of being. Clark is not going to stop being a risk taker. That identity is not a developmental stage she will graduate from with enough coaching. It is the competitive foundation that produced the Baghdad game winner and the 15 consecutive free throws and the no-look passes that create advantages no amount of defensive preparation can fully account for. Asking her to suppress that identity to earn a risk, Averse coach's trust is asking her to become a worse basketball player in exchange for organizational approval that still would not produce the results this roster is capable of generating. 7 points in 4 possessions. Without her on the floor, third option on the game-winning possession. Both statistically best defenders pulled simultaneously for defensive reasons. A 19-point lead surrendered against a losing opponent. These are not isolated failures. They are the documented output of a philosophical mismatch that the organization has not acknowledged and has not resolved. 3 all-WNBA caliber players. A 7-5 record against a schedule that includes multiple losing teams. The gap between what this roster should be producing and what it is actually producing is the exact size of the philosophical mismatch at its center. Spolstra would have been fired. The accountability standard that produces that outcome in the NBA has not been applied in Indiana. The record reflects the absence of that standard. Every time the Fever escape a game, they should be winning comfortably. The numbers do not have agendas. They just keep recording what happens, and what keeps happening is a generational talent making the organizational framework around her survivable through individual heroism, while that framework continues to work against her in every way the data documents. That is the Indiana Fever story. It is documented, it is specific, and it is not over.